Okay, welcome to everybody who's here with us on the call today. My name is Jaime Stief and I work with the Tamarack Institute. Welcome to the webinar, Do We Know the Problem We're Trying to Solve? It is a webinar with Liz Weaver and Sylvia Cheuy of the Tamarack Institute. We're pleased that so many of you have joined us today for a deeper dive into one of the key ideas explored in our collaborative governance and leadership series, which is designed to help you strengthen your capacity in both the process and people aspects of effective collaboration. Before we get started, we just want to take a moment to give some gratitude and acknowledgement. I am joining from the traditional territories of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples, colonially known as Waterloo, Ontario. And we do this sort of territorial acknowledgement to connect what we're doing here with our ongoing efforts towards truth and reconciliation and addressing the calls to action. And as we think about our collaborations in relation to today's conversation, it's important to always consider how our collaboration with Indigenous partners plays into the work that we're doing. So your hosts for today are Liz Weaver, who is the co-CEO of the Tamarack Institute and is also the in-house expert on collaborative leadership, as well as Sylvia Cheuy, who is our consulting director on collective impact. And with that, I am going to hand the mic over to Liz and Sylvia.
Thanks so much, Jaime. I think I'll start and then hand it over to Sylvia in a minute. This webinar today really comes out of some thinking and a deeper dive into collaborative governance and leadership. So I've been hosting with colleagues a series of workshops around collaborative governance and leadership. And we've been thinking about it not only in the context of collective impact, but also in the broader context of collaboration. And as part of those workshops, of which some of you have been participating, we have been asking those in those workshops, what are some of the challenges that you're facing? What are some of your collaborative leadership successes or collaborative governance successes, and what are some of your pain points? And coming out of all of that, there was a paper, an initial paper written called Solving the Problem of Collaborative Governance. And, also coming out of that was a whole series of papers that we're now releasing on a bit of a regular schedule that really explores collaborative leadership and governance and some different elements of it. And the papers are intentionally meant to be short, 5 to 7 pages, provide you with some tools and some ways of thinking, some new nuances about this work of collaborative governance, because there isn't a lot written in the broader fields. And so really, Sylvia and I got together to write a paper that was on this topic. In fact, Sylvia did the heavy lifting, if truth be told, but it builds on some of the thinking that I've been having around how do you implement and think about the Cynefin framework and problem-solving frameworks. And that's essentially what we want to do today with you all on the call, is to let you know about to go a little bit deeper on what problem we're trying to solve, but also to let you know about the collaborative governance and leadership series of papers that are coming out and the work that we're doing in this area. So Sylvia, I'm going to ask you the first question, which is really to tell us a little bit more about why it's so challenging to kind of enter into this space of defining the problem.
Beautiful. Thanks so much, Liz. I'm glad to be here and thrilled to see all the people joining us this afternoon. This is great. I think one of the reasons that it's not easy is that there are actually two really important facets that collaborators have to reach some kind of consensus on, and it's not necessarily easy. The first is, what is it that we want? What's the big it, right? What's the thing that's pulling us all together? So can we actually agree on that? Number one, and what are the outcomes? So if we're clear about the it, what is it we're trying to achieve? What's that aspiration? Can we, and to what extent are we sure that what we are identifying reflects the community's hopes and values, not just our own collective thinking? And can we be sure that there's broad energy and enthusiasm, both within our own at our own table, but also more broadly around it? And I think the last sort of thing that's challenging, but also exciting, is can we land on a goal that is ambitious enough that we're all going to have to let go of our same old ways of doing things? So that would be the one dimension. That's tough enough, right? But then the second dimension is getting clear amongst ourselves about what is the type of problem. Now that we're clear on what we're trying to achieve, what type of problem is it? And the reason that I think that that's really important, and why I love David Snowden's Cynefin Framework, is that there are 4 distinct types of problems. And getting the right definition is important because it affects the approach, right? What are the resources? How do we need to come together to do this work? So that's kind of the 2 areas that groups have to really solidify their collaboration around. So I'm going to flip it back to you then, because we're lucky enough to have this Cynefin framework that really helps tease apart those 4 distinct types of problems. I'm hoping that maybe you can walk us through it and then help us better understand the different approaches and ways of thinking underpinning each one of them.
Thanks, Sylvia. And yeah, at Tamarack, we've been around for about we're going into our 22nd year now. And this dilemma of, trying to define the problem has been with us from the very beginning, because we entered into the space of dealing with poverty and trying to work collaboratively to end poverty. And we all know that poverty is a complex problem, right? So it would sit in the frame of complex, as you can see on the slide in front of us. But there are parts of dealing with poverty that are simple. We can come up with some simple solutions, or we can go into the space of complicated, or sometimes called technical, or sometimes they're even chaotic. So the last couple of years with the pandemic have really increased our awareness of the chaotic nature that we find ourselves in. When a pandemic comes forward, all of a sudden the things that you were working on get shifted pretty radically, and you've got to readjust. So I'm going to walk you through the framework really quickly for everybody on the call. Cynefin is a Welsh word, and the word actually is interpreted as of place or in place. And David Snowden and his colleagues are the big thinkers behind the Cynefin framework. And we used to talk a lot about the Stacey framework, which is a little bit of an iteration of this, but the Cynefin framework seems a little bit more accessible. And what I really like about this version of the Cynefin framework is that it gives you some hints on how you as a group or as a collaborative might approach the work, right? So if you're trying to kind of tease out the problem a little bit, sometimes you're going to sense the problem, categorize what you need to solve that problem, and then respond based on the categorization that you do. And that's what you would do for simple or obvious problems. And a really good example of a simple or obvious problem is baking a cake, which is an example we use a lot at Tamarack, right? You sense that you want a cake, you categorize, so you go to the recipe and you make sure you have all the ingredients in your house and that you actually can make a cake and not make muffins or whatever else you have ingredients for. And then you respond by putting all the materials together and baking the cake. Now, some of us will have really good outcomes in that case. Others of us might not be as good at baking cakes, but we're all going to get cake at the end of the day if we sense, categorize, and respond. And so that's really a simple way, and you really look at best practice in the case of a simple or obvious problem. Baking a cake, really good example. In a complicated or technical problem, so a great example that we use a lot for complicated or technical problems is sending a rocket to the moon, for example. So in that case, you want to look at good practice, and you want to bring the people with the technical expertise into the room so that they can share their technical expertise in a way that you will be successful in building the rocket, sending it to the moon, and then having it return back from the moon. And the practice is sensing the problem, having all the technical experts, so are those with context information, knowing a lot about your community, analyzing what's going on. So we often will do mapping and that kind of thing. And then figuring out, given all this technical information, here's how we're going to respond. Here's how we're going to build the rocket. We're not going to build a flat rocket. We're going to build a pointed one. We need motors at the bottom, and we need enough of the other kind of technical expertise. So again, really interesting way of looking at it. The third domain is complex problems. And lots of our work fits within the complex problem domain. So if you're working on ending homelessness or ending poverty or trying to build better futures for children and families, addressing family violence, you know that there are a lot of actors in that space, whether it's the children, the families, the service providers, the funders, government. All of those kinds of actors have a role to play in all of this. And so what you need to do is you need to probe first as your first action. So what's going on in the space in which we want to work? And then where are there potential points for us to be able to do some early actions together? How do we make sense of this space, and where are those actions? And then think about responding. And really what we're doing in complex problems is we're really kind of looking at emergent practice, because we know at Tamarack, and you probably know this in your work in communities as well, that even as you begin to intervene in a community context, the community begins to shift, right? Because people who may not have been joined together, you're bringing them together, you're convening them, and they go, oh, I didn't know you did that, Sylvia, or I didn't know Jamie had that skill and expertise. And then you start to leverage those together. So complex, a really great way of thinking about complex problems is really act, react, and respond, right? So you're continually looking at what you're doing and then seeing how it's having an impact in the community, and then responding and reacting again to that. And then the final space that Snowden talks about is this space of chaotic problems. And COVID is a really good example. For those of you that live in BC, you've experienced forest fires across your province quite a bit in the last couple of years. They are chaotic problems, right? Where there's this emergency that presents itself, and you don't actually need to probe that emergency. That emergency is really present. What you need to do is to have leaders act and respond right away. So they act to solve the emergency, and then they sense what happened when we, had to evacuate our community. Were we able to do that effectively, right? So the acting is evacuating the community. The sensing is what worked in that evacuation process and what didn't work. And the respond in that case is then looking at continuous improvement and really building. And so the Cynefin framework, I think, is a really great way of thinking about problems and saying that not every problem shows up in the same way, right? There are some. And even with some problems, there are different elements of the problem, right? Some parts of it are simple, some parts of it are complicated, some parts of it definitely lean into complex. And then some parts of it, you might just even have to have a really quick action and then lean into the complexity of the problem. So yeah, I think it's a really great tool for thinking about problems in different kinds of ways, and then trying to categorize them in some way and thinking about how, as a collaborative table, we might act and respond. Before I go on, Sylvia, anything you want to think about here?
No, I think you've nailed it. I think what I really appreciated is that you are not, it's one thing to diagnose the problem writ large, but I think I really appreciate the nuance of, and even in the context of a large, problem, there are ways to act, or elements that are simple, elements that are technical or complicated, right? And I think teasing those out is really useful.
Yeah.
Because I think there's always that tension, right, between this issue that we know is going to take a while for us to see impact around, and yet the urgency in community to say, enough already, stop planning, we want to see something. And I think that helps juggle that a bit.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that. And I do think, there is that tendency, right, to get to best practice, to get to simple solutions for complex problems. And there are parts of it that are simple, right? But it is also still saying, hey, this is a complex problem. We're going to do some immediate actions, but we also have to sit in the complexity of the problem. So I have a question for you. If this is the Cynefin framework, why is it that multi-sector collaboration is the best approach?
Well, I can answer that, but I'm wondering if, before we go there, I know that you did a really great job of kind of animating the how the different elements may show up, like how there might be solutions that show up in the different quadrants. So maybe if we could walk through that, I think that might be a way to anchor this down a bit more.
Okay.
And for me, I think what I loved about this example is it shows it's not going to be one magic silver bullet that's going to do it, right? It's like this whole series of little things that create almost a tipping point.
Yeah, so if we could go to the next.
I think there's a couple we jump over. Yep, so go to the next one.
Perfect. So, yeah, one of the things that we were thinking about with some work we were doing in Virginia with a group called the Collaboration Lab was to try and tease out this idea of the Cynefin framework and the problem we were trying to solve. And so we started, in some ways, simplifying it and really thinking about, how it could be applicable and a helpful kind of approach for groups that are intentionally trying to move collaboration forward. And that's who was in this collaboration lab. And so defining the collaborative problem and opportunity, or opportunities, like the first step, right? So what's the current challenge? Recognizing that it's probably going to shift as you go into using this framework, but what's a good enough starting point for your current challenge? Who's involved? It is a little bit like theory of change. Some elements of theory of change come in here. How does the problem show up in the community or place-based context that you're working in? And then, what we encourage people to do in the collaboration lab was to look at, what's as much detail as you can put down in terms of framing the problem, so that you're kind of sitting yourself, and or you could sit your collaborative group within the parts of the problem. And if we go to the next slide, you can see how this starts to play out. So here you see the collaborative problem. So it's opportunity, and we have a tool for this. So we're going to share with you the steps, and then also provide you with the tool. But you put the problem there, and then you start to think about, well, okay, so if this is our problem, where does it show up in these 4 domains of types of problems, right? And so where can those, where are the pieces that are simple, the pieces that might be complicated, etc. So the next slide kind of gives you a sense of that. So Jamie, if you bring us to the next slide, so you can see we provided the folks in the collaboration lab with this slide, and they started to take their problems, and they were very different. So some of them were working on a health collaborative, which was really looking at mental health and well-being and all of the broader determinants of health. Others were working on neighborhood-focused work and really engaging neighborhoods. Some were working on racial equity. Another one was working on economic vitality in the region. And there was even a group that was working on really looking at the history, the deep history that was happening in Virginia. This is in the Dan River region in Virginia. And so embedded in their work was issues around equity and communicating the historical kind of history of the community, et cetera. So it was kind of cool to see this. So people started to put their problems in different places. I provided them with an example. So here's an example. If we go to the next slide, we can kind of hopefully walk you through an example. And this was one I was working on at the time. And I thought, well, rather than just have people start from nowhere, give them an example and have them start from somewhere. And so the example that I gave was that our collaborative is working to support youth to graduate from high school. And this is actually a real-time example that we're working with at Tamarack around our communities building youth futures work. And so this is really high level, but started to plot how that looked, you know. So the simple part of it is that there's a school system that provides education for youth in the community. So that's interesting. Young people show up, they go to class, they are successful in class or not, and they graduate from high school. It's a simple part of it, far more complex than that, but it is simple, and it starts to uncover for you, oh, okay, so the school system is an actor in this process and young people are an actor. So it's also starting to leverage that. Some of the complicated parts of the problem are that it's not accessible to all youth in all communities because of transportation, that because we were going online, this was at the very beginning of the pandemic, you know, not every young person had access to technology, particularly in some of the rural and remote communities that we were supporting. If you didn't live within the city limits, your family had much more challenges getting online. And in some cases, with some families, they only had one computer or one phone. And so that had to be shared across multiple children. And then if you start to go into the complex part of it, you know, educational achievement is not valued in the same way across different families. Some families have had poor educational outcomes, and so their willingness to show up for a parent-teacher interview might be influenced by their previous poor educational outcomes or poor educational experiences. There are jobs in some communities that don't require a high school education. And depending on your family circumstances, there might be a push to get a job rather than pursue education, both high school education or post-secondary. So that's where you start to tease out the more complex natures of the problems, because those elements are true for some, but not true for all. And so what is complex about it is to understand for how many people in our community, how many young people and how many families is this element true? And then as we start to tease out that complexity, then where do we land in, you know, the types of work that we want to do? Is it about, you know, focusing on families? Is it about focusing on young people? Is it about getting technology to young people? So that's a technical solution, or is it about uplifting the education system and what it all provides? So you can see how taking that problem and really kind of using the Cynefin framework can be helpful in terms of identifying the depth of the problem, but also potential solutions. I'm going to stop there and turn it back to you, because I think it kind of leads into the question that I asked you earlier, which is why we need multi-sector engagement around this.
Beautiful. And what I love, because I'm sitting here watching it, is particularly when we are working collaboratively, being able to map this together visually is so helpful, right? In helping a group that may be coming together for the first time to really think together and appreciate the perspectives of each other. in a really practical way. But if we jump to the next slide, I will answer your question about why. Oh, maybe one more. My goodness, we've got a lot of these. Okay, keep going to the next one, Jamie, thanks. Okay, so why? Why does multi-sector collaboration fit really well when the overarching issue we're hoping to address is complex? I think one of the reasons is it's hard to wrap your head around all the different dimensions and dynamics that affect the issue. And so the more diverse a group of leaders you can get around the same table, particularly those folks with lived and living experience of this issue, if we can map in a good way what we each know, we create a richer understanding of the issue overall. And I think it really helps us hold that mindset of curiosity and exploration, innovation, which is different than if you were to go to a networking event, right? Where each organization is talking about what they do. It really helps us to see what we have, but also what isn't getting tended to. And I think multi-sector collaboration is also publicly an acknowledgement that says we all have a shared responsibility for making progress on this issue. We can't just hand the hot potato off to the education sector because they're the ones that deal with youth, and then the rest of us kind of sit back and, every once in a while give a grade about how well is the system doing around this. And we also don't understand the limitations that individual sector that we want to hand the hot potato to might be trying to operate under. So that shared ownership is a fundamental, I think, shift in approach, which opens things up. And then I think lastly, the more sectors we engage meaningfully in this issue, when we get to a place where we're identifying, oh, well, here's some complicated things we could take on. Here are some simple things we could take on. We're all collectively much better able to acknowledge the strengths that exist in the community, but also building the commitment and understanding across such a diverse network that we need them to rally behind and not resist some of these newfangled additions to what we're doing. So those are just some of the big ones.
Yesterday I had a conversation with some folks who are working on developing a whole of community approach to career pathways. And one person in the group said, oh, I think that's the responsibility of XYZ organization in the community. And other people in the group responded. And my response was, yes, it is part of their responsibility, but they only have so many levers, right? So they will have levers in terms of knowledge and skills and connections, but they might not have the political levers. They might not have the financing levers. They might not have the levers into young people to bring their perspective into the table. And some other people in the community, they might not even have the business levers to have that career experience play out in the business community. And so that's why you need these multi-sector approaches, particularly with complex issues, is to say, okay, so at Tamarack, we have these kind of levers. In community, they have these kind of levers. In government, they have these kinds of levers. And citizens have levers that none of us have, right? They have levers to their neighbors, to their friends, to their connections in community. And so it is that kind of multi-sector perspective that I think makes a real difference.
It's interesting. Your comment sort of made me recall a perfect example of exactly the same thing and the importance of engaging across. It was in a small town, a guy with an incredibly successful plumbing business, right? He's, edging towards 60, saying, I still want to keep working, but I don't want to be working as hard and as long as I have been. Just learning that there were young people in the community who were not sure what the next step was for them, and also maybe not willing or able to make a huge financial commitment on a path that they weren't even sure was the right one. He just opened it up and worked with guidance to find 2 or 3 or 4 young people who were thinking that this might be a path forward for them, but they weren't sure, and gave them opportunities, right, to to be mentored, but also get paid to do work. And over time, he was able to slow down a bit and turn over more of that day-to-day stuff to these young people. And it was a win all the way around. So it's sometimes even inviting unusual players into the issue can generate options and contributions that no one could have ever anticipated beforehand.
And it tells me, and this is my next question for you, because I'm intrigued by this. It tells me about the importance of utilizing a tool like the Cynefin Framework as an opportunity to tell stories, right? Yeah. Both the story of the problem, the story of how the problem is playing out in the community, but the story of each of us as individuals or as collaborative partners. And so part of my question is, so what are the practices? What are some of the kind of framing and storytelling practices that you covered in the paper that are helpful in taking a tool like this and making it more concrete for the folks that are around the collaborative table?
Beautiful. So let's jump to that next slide, because I did want to tackle this a little bit. Framing and storytelling are two really critical strategies, I think, in particular, when you're dealing with a complex issue and you're working across a collaboration. Framing is sort of how we think about the problem, right? So the very act of sitting around and mapping out a Cynefin framework means that I come in with my knee-jerk understanding of the issue and my assumptions about what creates it and what we need to do to fix it. Whereas as we talk, what starts to happen when we're thinking together is this opportunity to say, well, maybe it isn't this, maybe it's more than this. And the moment we start to do that, then what starts to open up is new possibilities for solution that none of us would have been able to generate in and of them ourselves or within our own sector or sphere. And I think the best example for me, or one of the good ones, comes from the work of the Forum for Youth Investment, where there were all kinds of youth serving organizations brought together around the same table. What do you do? Well, we work to prevent youth involvement in criminal justice. Oh, well, we work to mitigate youth involvement with drugs and alcohol. Oh, well, we work to prevent STDs and teen pregnancy. Well, we work. And what was interesting was each one of these agencies was addressing a need that was true for some young people, but they were all very problem focused, right? And then someone introduced data that said, you know what we're learning writ large is that only 4 out of 10 young people leaving high school are actually ready for life. They are missing really critical things like how to overcome problems, how to make have a compelling vision and then work it back into some kind of achievable plan. The moment there was a reframe about this isn't just about solving problems with and for youth, but it's actually about getting them ready to, move into adulthood and manage their lives. Wow. Suddenly there's a whole array of other solutions and opportunities that we can now visualize that we couldn't before. And it really helps coalesce these partners, all of whom care about the success of youth, but to work together to do a value add on top of the current services that they already have. So the framing comes out of rich dialogue. If we can shift how we think about an issue, then the options for addressing it open and wide up. And that's kind of what we're looking for as sparks for innovation. And then storytelling, I think, is beautiful because it isn't just cognitive, right? It's head, but it's also heart. And story really braids those two elements together well. Someone said, I've never heard anyone launch a huge mobilization campaign based on data. So alone, right? Like a spreadsheet alone ain't going to do it. And I think that's part of what this is. So we as humans are hardwired biologically, right? To learn by story, to transfer story. And when you're dealing with an issue that that's complex and that has lots of strong opinions and often polarized opinions, right? the more we leave it abstract, the more people assume that they all agree, but they have wildly different interpretations of what that it is. And so story actually breaks through all of that and helps us anchor it in something practical, something real, and stay out of our heads and stay out of debate, right? Where do we agree? How can we move it forward? And we can remember it. And then there's this beautiful new body of work emerging around stories for social change, right? And how you actually need to think about what is that compelling story, the new story that we're telling, that we're inviting people to live into with us. And I think that's the other dimension. So strategically, how are we framing it in a compelling way that makes people want to be part of the change that we're starting to map out? So that for me is the big one. And if we go to the next slide, one of the things I loved as I was sort of thinking about this more was a great paper using story to change systems, which is there. And the author talked about 3 types of stories that are particularly useful for collaborative leaders leading a change journey to think about. So one is story as light, she said. So it's really about past, present, future. Where are the cracks in the current system, and how might we shed light on new opportunities and options for the future? Story as glue, which is really about emphasizing how we are all alike and how, despite some obvious differences, there are some commonalities that we share and that we can align around. And then stories as web, which is really about thinking, how can we tell a story that helps us connect both to ourselves, but also helps us understand and appreciate the uniqueness of the place that we're in and how that creates opportunities for action for us. So that's kind of what I've been thinking about around this. What are you thinking about that?
I think so. It's interesting, right? Because I think there is a weaving to some degree of the Cynefin framework and the story kind of aspects of it, even more intentionally. So to use the framework as an initial framing, but then telling stories, right? To say, then what is the story of us as individuals, and then what is the story of us as a community, and then what is the future story that we hope for, right? So that this is the framing, but then we have these kind of story moments that we can tease out, and to some degree theory of change as a way of kind of having conversations is it takes us there, but not as intentionally as storytelling does. So I find it really interesting to think about all these things and how they weave together.
And you've sparked something else for me, which is multi-sector collaborations. Ideally, we should be bringing citizen leadership together with organizational leaders. And I think one of the big stumbles I often see is that that citizen leaders and organizational leaders aren't the same, right? They come from 2 very different realities and often speak 2 different languages. And one of the most powerful things I learned was, we will put someone with lived or living experience at a table, but it feels very tokenistic. And one of the reasons for that is I can speak about my own story with relation, in relation to being poor or whatever. But I also am astute enough to know I can't represent, or my reality of poverty is not at all the same as many other people I know. So who am I to be speaking on behalf of all of us, right? And so if residents speak in story, that's beautiful. Once we've articulated our stories, the second step is, what are the common patterns and themes that transcend our individual stories or are, consistent? Because that's the kind of thing, not just the individual story that a context X could share, but it's that synthesis of those patterns, which I think then we as organizations and systems need to understand in terms of framing our action.
It's so interesting. I know we have another slide to share with people, but it's so interesting. I want to just share a quick story. So with this career pathways group that we're supporting, what we did as almost the first time that we met, there's always Tamarack uses check-ins and check-outs as part of our kind of pattern of engaging people. And so there is the check-in question was, tell us about your career pathway experience and what was that about? So we heard from each individual in the room their story. So we didn't try to solve the problem. We heard the stories first, and then we looked at the patterns that emerged from those stories. And those patterns are continuing to evolve into some of the work that we're doing. So I think that, you know, it's almost like, I wonder if we almost did this presentation in the wrong format, right? Where you did the storytelling first, then you use the Cynefin framework to bring out the patterns. What of the stories that we just heard are simple, complicated, complex, and chaotic? And then what is the story of the future that we're hoping for? So, you know.
Oh, that's neat.
There's an aha moment, everybody. You just joined us on an aha journey here that we'll probably play around with a little bit more at Tamarack. But you can see how, you know, at Tamarack, I think what I love about this space and the space that you're all working in is that it's iterative, right? It shifts and changes and evolves as new thinking and new perspectives come into this. And so, yeah, just the way you presented today, Sylvia, just had me really thinking a little bit differently about how we might do this a little bit differently.
Oh, that's neat. Now I want to try it that way and see how it plays out. So I have one last question for you before we open it up, and hopefully we'll hear both comments and questions from folks and stories as well. So what leadership capacities are you seeing as being really important to help collaboratives navigate complex issues?
Yeah, so if we go to the next slide, I think this is a really helpful kind of framing slide for this. So, you know, we know, you know, I said, as we begin to intervene, things start to shift, right? And some of that is predictable, but some of it is like, who could have predicted the pandemic, right? And now we're in the tridemic. So, as someone has said recently to me, so it's really being comfortable with the uncertainty, but really kind of saying, okay, what is that step I want to take forward, right? Or that we collectively want to take forward. And then, you know, acting, reacting, and adapting as we go is really a critical one. But while you're doing that, looking at patterns, right? Are the patterns that we're seeing now, are they the same patterns that we saw in the past? And then can we reasonably predict that they are the patterns of the future, or are they new patterns that are emerging? So pattern recognition, that's the work of organization called Human Systems Dynamics that's based out of the US, and they are big on pattern recognition. And I think pattern recognition is a critical competency that we all need to pay attention to, because when we don't recognize patterns, we tend to do the same thing over and over again. And some of those things are maybe not as successful as they could be. So pattern recognition is really an important competency. And then really thinking about what are the mindsets and skill sets that we need to navigate complexity, right? And this article by Collab is helpful, right, in terms of providing us with some go-tos that we can put into our skills that we either have and do well, or would like to build in ourselves as leaders who are trying to puzzle out the puzzle of community. And so the zooming in and zooming out. I had a conversation just before this call with a group in Toronto, and I said, yeah, you know, sometimes you have to go very close to the problem and very granular, and then sometimes you have to zoom out and look at the patterns. You know, Ron Heifetz talks about it, from being on the dance floor and being on the balcony, right? So sometimes you want to be in the dance, and sometimes you want to actually look at how the dance is unfolding in front of you. Power, you mentioned it already. The fact that there is power over and power with. And so where do we bring our own power, or where do we enable other folks that are in the journey with us? How do we enable the power with the other voices that are in the room? And so I can read this whole list and talk about each of them, but you can all see that on the screen. And so I do think, you know, part of our work as leaders that are trying to move change forward is to always check in with ourselves. Where are we feeling, you know, we've got some strengths, and where do we have some gaps, and who else in our group might bring those strengths to the table where we have gaps, and what can we learn from them? What is that famous Sufi wisdom that when you're ready, the teacher will come? And I think that that's kind of like, you know, sometimes we put all the pressure on ourselves to be the leader and the front of the room. But I think it is like letting these capabilities or these competencies or capacities, let the group embrace them, and have the folks that have the strengths in them show up and give that gift to all of us. So I you know, so I love thinking about it in that way.
And what I love is that you've really captured both that it's really as much an internal journey, right, as it is what you manifest out there as your quote unquote part of this leadership team, and that we're all on that journey. And so another plug for the power of multi-sector collaboration, or being part of a collaborative effort, is, as you said, that, you know, the skills then are distributed. I don't have to have them all. If you've got some, great. But it also reminds me that it's a beautiful place to practice how I might build out my skill set, because I can work in tandem with you, and you can mentor me on developing this skill, and then I can sort of, you know, take on leadership around a skill I feel really confident in, and vice versa. So fantastic.
Hey, we've got
I'm dying to.
You and I were probably going to say the same thing. Are there any questions, or did anything pop up in the chat box for Jamie?
So in the chat, we've been talking a little bit about the situations where the different actors across sectors either don't feel invited to the table. To that, you know, I think when I worked in public health, and different provinces had different policies about whether or not the public health workforce could even engage in advocacy on social determinants of health. We've talked about situations where, you know, the people who have the power to make the decisions don't have access to maybe the lived experience or the networks they need, and we can absolutely share resources if anyone wants to learn more about lived experience. So anyways, we've been having a conversation about that, sort of the politics around who's at the table, who has access to the levers, and who is maybe bound by politics to only utilize the levers they have access to in a very specific way. In terms of what has been shared in the Q&A box, we see a question from Alex, who says, when taking a systems approach, especially under a multi-sector collaboration, there's an issue with great conversations happening, but often not leading to tangible, practical initiatives. How would you tackle this issue of being able to have a high-level, systems-level perspective, but involving stakeholders in taking away pieces to hold and act upon?
Nice, juicy question, Alex.
Do you want to start, Sylvia?
I can start it. I think, the first thought I had was the power of building those unusual relationships and just gathering around the table enables us first and foremost to take stock of what we do have, right? And invite people to say, these are the kinds of things I can contribute, which automatically, I think, sparks, okay, well, I can do this, or, these are pieces that I can take on. It also allows us to make simple shifts in better aligning and connecting the services that we do provide, which is an early win often for those folks that are needing greater support than we have been offering. Because now I have a relationship with you, and now I can pick up the phone, or now, I understand that you are dealing with these sorts of folks and I am too. So how might we collaborate in a very small way around a certain piece? That would be one thing. I also think that, it's important for us to, because I've also seen a tension where we then say, well, we can't change any of this because all the power, because things are done to us, right? And we don't have influence on these things. So I think it brings back for me, John McKnight's, what do we have? What are the things that we ourselves can do right now, right? That we don't necessarily need support from outside the community to do. And let's get busy on those. And then explicitly tease out what are the things that we could do, but we might need some support from outside, and with whom and from whom, right? So that kind of gets us into more maybe of the complicated or technical elements of problems. And then what are the things that, where systems are impacting us, and where are our opportunities to shift attitudes and behavior with story and create sort of a momentum for broader system actors to see the need for change, or to create a safe environment for them to introduce, new, maybe more provocative approaches that because there's a sense that there's more receptivity. So those are just some initial thoughts. What about you? What's coming up for you about this?
Yeah, I think I totally agree with all the things that you've just said. And I think it is a tension, right? We call it the process product tension at Tamarack often. And I think you referred to that, Sylvia, a little bit. What I found to be really interesting, and this is where the point you made about multi-sector groups is so important, right? So government typically and nonprofits are really good at process. We almost give a lot of bias to process, right? And want to make sure that everybody feels comfortable and and spend time kind of really defining the problem and things like that. Often what I've seen is that business community leaders and people with lived experience are product people. They are really looking for that solution as a driver. And so to solve a complex problem, you need the tension of process and product. And that shows up when you have multi-sector collaboration. Because the tension is, what can we do right away to solve some of these simple and technical elements of the problem, and also creates a space for those people who feel really comfortable in process to think about the complexity of the problem. And so it actually fits really nicely into the Cynefin framework and really makes a case, I think, for why multi-sector collaboration is so vital to this work, particularly around complex issues. Because you don't want to jump too quickly to solutions, but there are simple solutions out there that are part of a more complex problem. But you also want to kind of deeply understand the complexity and how that's playing out in the context in which you're working. So, or the context in which you find yourself. So yeah, it's such a good question, Alex. I don't have the simple answer for you. I just have my observations about it.
Thank you both for that. Oh, go ahead, Sylvia.
No, go ahead, because I see Alex has added even more. So this is great. Jamie, what has Alex posted?
All right, Alex has a follow-up question for you, and which they ask: in a multi-sector collaboration, you are dealing with stakeholders who have a different sense of timing, political elections being one. When looking at relationship links, there's often a lack of dynamic understanding in delay effects and the mechanisms of change. How would you tackle this issue of making sure that, I see the word stakeholders, we're at Tamarack, we're moving away from the word stakeholders towards like partners and that sort of thing, but the people you're working with and who are affected by the decisions, they understand this delay effect?
couple of thoughts I have just off the top of my head. One is, wouldn't it be great to do a timeline? Each different partner, like I think you illustrated it beautifully, folks with lived and living experience have a level of urgency that holds us all accountable to not just look into the future, but also to be thinking about what can be done right away. Business sector culture, quarter to quarter. We need to be sensitive that they need to, they need to be able to see a value. Because they're so driven by quarter to quarter accountability. So how might we create a level of conversation which says, there is some urgency for some early things. What can we do that's early, right? There is, this issue is not going to be resolved in one election cycle or one grant cycle. So what can we get done? What's good enough to be a key milestone we can all drive for that shows meaningful progress, knowing that there are other things that we need to work on in terms of new legislation or these kinds of things that are going to take longer. And share ownership for generating results at different time spans, but not shying away from an either or choice.
Yeah, and I just would add in, I don't know, Alex, if you have seen the tool from FSG called the Water of Systems Change, but it's a really great framing tool, right? And if we're trying to shift a system, which sometimes is a longer term endeavor, it's really, they say that there are 6 elements within the system that you can shift. And so at the top end, the explicit end, are things like policies, practices, and resource flows. And policies could be policies of government, but they could also be internal policies to our organizations, internal practices to our organizations, practices of funders, etc. So top level, policies, practices, resource flows. The middle level is semi-implicit, which are things like social connections. Is the work that we're doing increasing social connectivity in our community? And then power dynamics, to what degree are we supporting or enabling power biases to continue in our community? Are we distributing power more effectively? And then the final one is mental models. So to what degree is the work we're trying to do shifting mindsets and mental models? And, my experience comes from working in poverty in my community before I joined Tamarack. And part of our early work was to shift the mindset of the community, not everybody, because it's 500,000 people, or more now, but to really begin to shift a substantial number of people and how they thought about whether poverty was something we could tackle or not as a community. And so that one was an early focus of our work. We started to build a large kind of movement for this change. And then we went up to policies, practices, and resource flows, power, and social connection. So it doesn't matter which way you enter into the water systems change. It's just a really nice way of framing what systems change potentially could look like. And I think for me, what's been really helpful about that tool is that it's given us some ideas around the system. Right? Because so often we talk about systems change and system transformation and like people zone out.
And I'm going to add one quick plug because I know we're at the top of the hour, but we've also been doing some good thinking at Tamarack about our role as a field catalyst. So which means that we are helping to link similar local efforts together and then do another level of collaboration around shifting some of those systems and engaging those system actors. So there's another piece. But we're out of time. Can you believe it? Jaime, over to you.
Thank you so much for joining us today. As we've been talking about in the chat, everybody who registered for today's event will be getting a copy of the recording and all the resources we've been sharing. I'm hoping to get that out by this coming Monday. And you'll also, those of you who attended will be prompted to fill out a survey once you leave the room. And we'd love to hear what you thought about today's session and any topics you'd like to hear about from us in the future. And with that, we'll say goodbye. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Liz.
Bye.